Google dropped their most recent model, Gemini 2.0 Flash, and it's probably the best price to performance model that you can use today. So I made a post about it saying RAG might not be needed anymore, and a lot of people misunderstood what I meant, and some people got pretty upset. So in this video, I'm going to break down exactly what I meant. I'll go over RAG, why I don't think it's needed in the traditional sense anymore, how these new AI models might change the way you think about building AI products, and what this means if you're a builder or someone who's just getting into AI. Dive in. First, let me quickly explain what RAG is for those of you who might not know. So RAG stands for Retrieval Augmenting Generation, and it's been around for a while. It's a very, very common technique used to sort of help LLMs like ChatGPT sort of bring information that may have not existed in its sort of like training corpus. And you'll see this a lot with sort of companies like Perplexity, where they will sort of augment your questions when they search the web or things like that. Or if you look at ChatGPT, if you have sort of projects in ChatGPT, you add files. Now, what happens behind the scenes is that there's this thing called context windows. Context windows basically mean how much text you can give to an AI before it can't answer. And in 2023, 2 years ago, which is in eons in AI, they had very small token limits. So if you actually go but look back in early 2023, you had 4,000 token limits. So RAG at the time was very, very important. And what you would do, it was a common technique, was you would take your information and you would create embeddings. Then you would store that in a vector database. So if you had a large corpus of text, files, PDFs, you would take it and you would do this thing called chunking. And this is important. You would take small pieces of text, there would be roughly 256 to 512 tokens. So just let's call it a paragraph, and you would take that text and you basically would turn it into an embedding. And then you would put that in a vector database. So then when a user would ask a question, you would take their question and you would try to find and search what are the most relevant tiny little chunks of information that I can grab and give it to a large language model to help it answer. Whereas if you have something like large context, which is Gemini's 2.0, 1 million and 2 million context, you can just give it all of that information and then let the user answer it. Now, this is important to know the difference. So back then, we only had 4,000 token limits. Nowadays, the token limit is very big. You have very, very large token limits. Now you have things like Gemini, which has 1 million tokens. Some even have 2 million tokens. And you can see here in this chart the difference, right? 3.5 had 4,000 tokens, which is about 6 pages. Whereas nowadays, you can give Gemini 2.0 Flash over 1 million tokens, which is a lot of text. And that's actually still pretty accurate. So if you actually look here, this is the hallucination rate. So for those of you who don't know hallucination, it's how likely is it for the AI model to make things up. And Gemini's newest model, Google's newest model, has the lowest hallucination rates. You have these models who are very, very different than what they were in 2023. So when I made this post saying that RAG is dead, the traditional sense of taking a single document and turning it into little chunks no longer needs to exist. If you look at the code snippets these days, this is about 20 lines of code. If you've used ChatGPT or if you use any, Cursor, Sonnet, it can code you. And the beautiful part about this is you can actually just give it the link to the PDF. So it's so much easier now that you don't even need to go through the embedding process. However, there is a lot of specifics I wanted to cover now that we understand RAG. So now let me explain to you why I said RAG in quotes is dead. Okay. And I'll give you a couple of very clear use cases on when you would just give the models the context versus when you wouldn't. So take an example scenario of a transcript of an audio call. Okay. So let's say we have a large transcript. It's a super large transcript, and maybe it's of sort of a earnings report. Now, in an earnings report, there's a lot of things that are said. The CEO might say things like, so and so finances were for this fiscal year. We use this technology. There is a lot to unpack. Now, usually they're like, let's call it, an hour long, and let's just say, to keep it simple, they're about 50,000 tokens. Okay, so now you have a 50,000 token, 50K token transcript, earnings call. Okay, now what a lot of people would do is they'd be like, oh, wow, what I want to do is I want to turn this into smaller chunks. Let's say, you know, I want to do small, tiny little chunks of maybe let's call it 512 tokens. So paragraphs. And there are actually a lot of different sort of what they call chunking techniques that you can use, which I won't get into. But let's say for simplicities, we're doing this. We take this earnings call and we're like, okay, we're gonna take it and we're gonna turn it into a bunch of chunks. So this is gonna be about 100 chunks. Now, in this scenario, what happens and the issue that you actually run into with naive chunking and RAG is that you cannot reason over this content. So in RAG, there are two main things. Can I find the facts and the information, and can I reason over the data? The issue with RAG today is that when you are chunking and you are sort of embedding, you cannot reason over the information. And this example is a perfect use case because let's say I am sort of an analyst and I want to read into this transcript. If I ask a very specific question, a fact, I can say, you know, what was the net revenue? That's a pretty easy number to find. Like you probably as a human could control F, look up revenue, and you could probably find it very quickly. That's not very valuable to you. Maybe 2 years ago it was, but not so much anymore. You might ask something like, how does their outlook earnings compare to blah 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 blah. You're going to ask a very loaded question that requires reasoning over the transcript. So you might say, okay, I want to know, what is the outlooks like? I want to ask the AI, like maybe this is a good investment, is it a bad investment? Now, to do that, how would you translate that to finding the right chunks? And when you do this chunking process, generally what happens is you take the user's query, you basically try to find the most similar sort of chunks of text, and then give that to an LLM. Traditional RAG does not work. You cannot do that. There has to be a lot of very complex sort of agentic RAG, and there's a whole rabbit hole of the different things you could do, but it just doesn't work. Now, let's assume for simplicity's sake, we actually take this transcript and we just use that line of code and we just give this to Gemini. Now, Gemini, with its reasoning, can look at the transcript. It can look at maybe how the CEO said a specific thing. It can look at maybe one of their earning reports, whatever numbers they might have mentioned at the beginning of the call. And they can look at the end of the call, and maybe they can look at the questions that he answered in between the call. It can reason over 50,000 tokens and give you a significantly better and more accurate answer to your question. And this concept is sort of what I meant to say when I said rag killer. Is that the traditional way of doing things that a lot of people assume is rag, which is I have a single document, I have a single PDF, I have two PDFs, I just want to answer some questions about it. That method is obsolete. You do not need to do that anymore. You can go to Gemini, you can go and use AI, Google's models, and you can literally go to AI Studio, by the way, drag and drop it. You can go to Studio here. You can drag all the documents that you want, and you can just ask Google. And I highly recommend that everyone, if you have these sorts of sort of documents, please go to Google and upload it because you're not going to get any better results. However, RAG, retrieval augmented generation, in the more broad sense, because there's so many definitions, is not dead. And I'll give you a very good example because sometimes what people will say in the comments, they're saying, well, what if I have 100,000 documents? What if I have the earnings call for 2023 and 2024 and 2025? And maybe I have also, for some reason, in all my files that I uploaded to the AI, I have NVIDIA's, maybe this transcript's about Apple, maybe I have NVIDIA's, and maybe I have a bunch of irrelevant documents. And in that use case, RAG does apply. Now, again, the difference here is in that case where I have 100,000 documents, what are you probably going to want to do? If I have 100,000 documents, I'm probably just going to search for them. I'm not going to overcomplicate things. I'm going to search. I'm going to, do not a control F, but there's a lot of existing search systems that will help you find it. So now I'm going to say, okay, look, I found all of Apple's earnings reports. Okay, great. That's maybe 10 documents. However, I wouldn't still go in and chunk those because you're not able to reason over it. And what I would do instead is actually I would throw all 10 documents to Google Gemini separately. So, okay, let's just go through an example. Let's say I have 10,000 documents and I have managed to filter down to three. Now, what I like to do more recently, if you don't care too much about paying a little bit more, is I like to do parallelization. And this is a technique that sort of I saw happen on Twitter, and a lot of people sort of have been talking about it more recently with the DeepSeek launch. And pretty much what you will do is you will, find your 3 or maybe it's 5 most relevant documents, and instead of chunking them and doing those 512 little tokens, because the AI models are so cheap these days, what I would recommend is you take these documents and you throw all 3 of them in parallel to Google's Gemini. So instead of me saying, "Hey, I'm gonna take this, I'm gonna find that," I'm gonna actually take them separately, by the way, separately, and I'm gonna ask them the same question. And the difference that you'll see, and you can go ahead and try this on your own, when you're getting questions answered, will be monumental. So what I would do is I would look at this, I'd say, okay, maybe the user asks some question. I take that same question, right, and I give it to all of the 3 documents separately. Say, hey, maybe this is called Gemini. I could say, Google 1, Google 2, and Google 3. Then I will take this and then finally use all of these, right? I will merge all of these and finally answer the user's question to do whatever I want. This is not a new technique by any means. This is sort of like a MapReduce where you're filtering and removing all of the irrelevant information, okay? And instead of, again, what I'm trying to get at here is this embed in chunk just doesn't work anymore, right? This is what traditional RAG systems are. I do a search, and then I will take these 3 documents, I will parallelize them, I'll ask Google to look at all of them separately, take the answers, and finally take that final answer and give it to another AI and answer it. Now, this is a significantly more robust system. And because the models are so much cheaper today, by the way, it's Google's models are extremely cheap. If you are looking for quality answers, this is the best way to do it, especially because of how low the hallucination rates are and how well they can sort of find the information you're finding. So hopefully that explains the post here of Rag is dead slash Rag killer a little bit more. And if you are looking at building Rag or doing things, I just recommend starting simple. I feel like people like to overcomplicate things. If you're a solo hobbyist, just keep it simple. Use things like, uploading the file to this specific system, and only when you need to make it more complex. Again, I think a lot of people will like to add complexity when it isn't needed. In a year from now, this might change. Maybe the models get 100 times cheaper, they get 100 times more efficient. You might not even need this filtering step. Who knows? But at the end of the day, I think the traditional RAG that most people kind of, if you're not too familiar, see, I don't think it's going to exist. I don't see any point because you cannot reason over all of the data to give you a very sufficient answer. So that's all for today's video. Hopefully that gives you guys a little bit more understanding of why RAG in the traditional sense doesn't work and why, again, Gemini's Google model is so strong and useful, especially for these kind of use cases, if whether you're building a product, whether you yourself are like an analyst and you want to read all the documents. The new model from Google, very, very useful. And guess what? One other thing to add, when you do this step, okay, you say giving all this stuff, you can sort of mix and match the AI models. But if you really wanted to, you say, hey, look, I'm going to get a really, really cheap model. I'm going to get it to look at all these documents, give its answers, and I'm going to take those answers and give it to O1 Pro or O3. I can give it to a lot smarter model. As opposed to, trying to get the AI model to pick the right chunks. It just doesn't work. So that's all. Hope you guys enjoyed the video. Peace.